Hello and welcome back. This week we're on our second part of South America and we're looking at Argentina, which is a really lovely, diverse country, lots of different areas producing some really fantastic wines. So we'll look at three of those as we go through today. It's actually the fifth largest producer of wine in the world, which is surprising because you don't see a huge amount of it on the shelves over here compared certainly to European wines. But there's a lot of wine made there. Only 25% of it's exported, and that's mostly the quality wines. The Malbecs, Chardonnays and so forth that we're familiar with. A lot of the wine is produced from the so-called pink skin varieties, things like Criolla Chica, which we saw last week as Pais in Chile, and also Criolla Grand, Moscatel, Cereza, all these grapes that we're not familiar with that just make loads and loads of jug wine that's consumed domestically in restaurants and at home. The advantage these pink-skinned varieties have, and the reason so much of them were planted throughout South America, is they're quite resistant to heat. Pais or Criolla Chica is quite good in warm climates. It doesn't overcrop. It still produces a perfectly nice drinkable wine, and that's the reason they were planted sort of throughout the area. The move to the higher altitude vineyards, which is mostly what we'll be looking at today, was pioneered by growers such as Nicholas Catena, among others. And exploiting these higher altitudes to try and get a little bit more elegance into the wine. And the results weren't quite what they were expecting. They were just expecting it to be a little bit cooler, but in fact they found that the grapes ripened slightly differently. We've talked about altitude before in vineyards, but Argentina really is at the extreme end of this. The zone in which most of the vineyards are is the Andean Cordillera, which is a strip of land roughly north to south between the Andes and the inland desert. A lot of the area, the Andes, is just way too high and too arid, and the other side is desert, so that it's only this little strip of green in the middle that is really suitable for growing the vine. This Cordillera stretches from the north in Salta right down to the south in Patagonia, and we've got wines from both ends of that area to look at today. The vineyards further south are naturally cooler, with it being the southern hemisphere, and those further north you naturally find at higher altitudes because that's where you get the coolness that you wouldn't otherwise get the closer to the equator that you get. And at the higher altitudes, although you do get very warm days, it's the drop of temperature overnight that is really important to the way that the grape ripens. It's this so-called diurnal variation, the difference between daytime and nighttime, that's really important in retaining acidity and fruit character in the wines. The difference between day and night temperature in some of these vineyards is as much as 20 degrees centigrade, which if you think about it would be the difference between a nice warm summer's day in the UK and a frost overnight. It's that much of a drop, but it's really important that the vines don't get overcooked. Being near the desert, the rainfall is naturally quite low, so most of the irrigation, and they have to irrigate, comes from the Andean meltwater. They used to flood irrigate, which is fine, it works, but it's not perfect. And even a variation of that, which is channel irrigation, where the water is channeled down the rows of vines, still isn't brilliant. The best, as practiced by some of the top producers, is drip irrigation, because it means you can get the right amount of water to the vine when it needs it, rather than simply flooding it. What this means is if you get too much water, particularly when the grapes are swelling, they can burst or the wine can be too dilute. You really need the right amount of water at the right time. One happy side effect of this dryness is that there's very little problem with rot or fungal problems, which can affect vines, particularly in Europe and North America. Phylloxera is also not much of a problem here. Similar to Chile, the vineyards are quite remote and they have quite strict plant quarantine rules in place to prevent the spread of the bug. But that said, most quality producers now do graft their vines onto resistant rootstocks to future-proof them, because just because there hasn't been a problem so far doesn't mean it won't come in time, because phylloxera is still present in just about every vineyard in most of the rest of the world. Looking at the wine regions north to south, we're starting in Salta. Now this has some of the highest altitude vineyards anywhere really. This particular one is from about 1700 metres. To put that into context, Ben Nevis I think is about 13,500 metres, so this is extremely high altitude vine growing. The grape we're looking at here is Torrontés, which is unique to Argentina. You will see Torrontés occasionally on labels from Spain and Portugal, but this grape is actually a crossing of Criolla Chica and Muscat of Alexandria, which both quality grapes, and it makes a wine that is, I think, unique to Argentina, and it's nice to see something that is very much of its place. So give the first wine a taste. Lovely floral aromas. You've got a little bit of honeysuckle, lovely freshness, a little bit of citrus peel, mandarin. A lot of the same flavours coming through on the palate, much more tropical actually on the palate, a little bit of pineapple, lovely citrus quality again, mandarin, and a little bit of dryness. If you think of an orange pith, it's got that slightly drying texture but still the flavour. It's got that going on as well. It's a really lovely balanced wine. This, I think, would work really well with something like a Thai green curry. Traditionally, you always think of Gewürztraminer with that, but I think this has just got a lightness of touch. Gewürztraminer can actually almost be too overpowering, and I think this would work really well with something like that. Or even Japanese and Korean cuisine, again, because it's just got that lightness of touch. It's got the lovely floral element, but it's a little bit more restrained, I think, than many Gewürztraminers are. They're also in the area in Salta and further south, increasing plantings of other white varieties, particularly Chardonnay. The University of California at Davis actually produced a Mendoza clone specifically for the dry, high altitude vineyards of Argentina, and it's actually now becoming quite popular in areas like Australia, particularly in the inland irrigated areas of Australia where they're quite arid and there's very little water. They're finding the same clone works really well there too. There's other white grapes grown in roughly descending order: Chenin Blanc, Uni Blanc, Pinot Gris, some of it brought over by the Lurtons of Bordeaux fame from Alsace cuttings, and a little bit of Viognier. I'm actually not that keen to see Viognier there because I think it's actually quite similar to Torrontés, and I really like that they're focusing on their own grape and making wines that are stylistically very Argentinian. There was also later immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century from a lot of Europe, and that brought some other grape varieties over. Bernarda from Lombardy in northern Italy is actually the second most planted red grape in Argentina, and we're seeing a little bit of it over here, but it's not really being exploited as much as it could, and it's another reason why I think there's a lot more to come from Argentina. There's a lot more interesting wines. Also some Tokai Friulano, Touriga Nacional, all of these planted by these later settlers. And they're just sort of rediscovering some of these vines, taking more cuttings, replanting, and I think we're going to see something a little broader than the usual Malbec, Merlot and other grapes that we're familiar with, which are great in themselves, but it's nice to see a bit more diversity coming through as well. Heading further south, we've passed through Catamarca and into La Rioja. La Rioja is actually the best clone of Torrontés, is Torrontés Riojana. There are others as well, but I find with some of them, they don't quite have the best flavour. That lovely floral aroma in some of the poorer examples I've had is a little bit soapy, a little bit like washing up liquid. It's not as pleasant as this example and others that we're seeing in the UK now. San Juan, a bit further south again, it's second in terms of production, about 20% of the volume, but it's also mostly large-scale domestic consumption of those pink-skinned jug wines, which are lovely, but you just don't see them over here. The main region that we're coming to next is Mendoza. It's a name that everybody knows if you know anything about Argentinian wine, and it's roughly 2/3 or more of Argentinian production is in this one area. There are a variety of subregions in Mendoza, and they're still experimenting with some really high altitude areas. Some of the best ones are Luján de Cuyo, which has some of the best Malbec, with it being slightly higher. Maipu, which is lower, a little bit warmer. Suits Cabernet a bit better, it just needs that little bit more warmth. There's the same amount of sunshine, but it's just that little bit warmer, and Cabernet prefers that. San Rafael, which is still part of Mendoza, but a bit further southeast, is cooler. Suits white varieties a bit better. There's some really nice Chenin grown there. There's some superb producers in all areas, but the highest proportion of the best vineyards are in the Uco Valley, which is where we're coming to next with this Malbec. Now this is from Tupungato, which is right at the very top of the Uco Valley at the highest altitude. I think this vineyard is roughly 1,500 metres above sea level, so very high indeed. And you wouldn't think that at that altitude it would really suit red grapes. You can understand it with a lovely light fragrant white like this, but Malbec being quite deep in colour, there's impression in your mind that it would only suit a really warm climate, a really hot climate, but in fact the reverse is true. It really suits this high altitude. You get a high proportion of ultraviolet light at this altitude, and that ripens the grapes physiologically slightly differently. There's also the effect of the diurnal variation, those cool nighttime temperatures, but also the higher proportion of ultraviolet. There is a lot of thinking that it actually ripens the fruit characteristics and the phenolics in the grape skins rather less so than the tannins, which are present, but they're a lot more supple and subtle in Malbec from Argentina and Mendoza in particular. This Cereza Malbec is unoaked, so you're getting the pure expression of the grape here. It suits oak really well, but I just wanted to try one at an entry level that has just the purity of fruit, so you just get the expression of how the grape and the place affects the taste of the wine. So it's really sort of deep, plummy fruit we're getting here. Sort of mulberry, blackberry, a little bit of violet coming through, a little bit of that sort of floral element, but again, quite deep and rich. Really lovely acidity that holds it all together. You're getting that lovely sort of mulberry, damson fruit coming through, but it's balanced with the acidity, and it's got a lightness of touch that is a world away. If you think of Malbec from France, particularly Cahors, they're almost black, dark, brooding, fiercely tannic, whereas this, it's got a real elegance to it, which is not something that people automatically associate with the New World, but it's a really lovely wine. Often when people talk about Malbec, they associate it with steak, and yes, it would work really well with steak, but I think something a bit lighter like venison would work really well, pate, that kind of thing. I think it's just a really nicely balanced wine. And superb value for money, as all Argentinian wines are. It has lovely poise, and it has concentration without necessarily being a big jammy fruit bomb of a wine. Whenever we think of the New World, we always think of Aussie Shiraz and yes, Argentinian Malbec, and there's often an impression that it's a big wine, and it isn't necessarily so, particularly these really high altitude wines. They've got a real poise to them. Further south again, we have Patagonia and the subregions of Neuquén and Rio Negro. Naturally, we're getting cooler as we move further south, so the vineyard areas here are at lower altitudes. Higher altitude down here would just be far too cold for growing any kind of vines. You don't have such a big swing in temperatures between day and night here, so the wines are slightly different. They don't have necessarily the elegance and poise. They're perhaps a bit more towards Bordeaux in style with the climate and the way in which the grapes ripen. And I think that's reflected when we come to taste this third and last wine from Rio Negro. Typical of most Merlots, this has a lovely velvety texture on the nose and on the palate. You're getting a little bit of plum, a little bit of plum crumble. It's got almost that sort of baked, slightly biscuity character, possibly from a little bit of oak. I don't know if there's any oak in this, but I'm getting a little hint of that sort of character coming through. Lovely velvety texture. It's got good acidity, but it's not as piercingly high as the Cereza Malbec. This is opulent, but not over extracted. It has lovely flavours of damson, a little bit of blueberry in there as well. Really nice structure, a nicely balanced wine. This would work really well with something like Iberico ham. Quite strong, salty flavours it could stand up to. But equally good drunk on its own. It's a really nice, soft, easygoing wine. So I hope you've enjoyed this little run through north to south in Argentina and South America as a whole. I think it's a really exciting area. I think both countries are producing some fantastic wines already, but there's a potential in both to produce some absolutely world-class, world-beating wines. I think we've only just seen the beginning of what they're capable of doing, because it's really only in the last 20, 30 years that both countries have really got their act together and started producing some interesting wines. And the future, I think, is really exciting in both countries. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for coming.